Blog Talk Radio.
And welcome to another edition of Carnivore Radio. I'm your host, Chef Sherman, along with Dr. Eric Lopkin. We have a tentative guest, Mr. Romano, he's the head of the Connecticut Republican Party. We wanted to talk to him about basically the big news, Dr. Lopkin, which is the appointment of Kamala Harris to the ticket with Biden. What do you think of that?
I think it was a bad idea. So far, seeing the responses on social media, I have seen tons of African Americans basically go back to her record as an attorney general and say, there is no way we can support this woman. And then I've seen the progressive left, the folks that were, AOC supporters and Bernie supporters, and they're saying she's not far enough, she's not progressive enough. We're either going to vote for the Green Party, maybe we'll vote for Kanye, or we're staying home. So I think all of the expected benefits that Kamala Harris was supposed to bring with her completely backfired on the Democrats.
I think it was I agree with you. I don't think it was, I think she got some, you know what's amazing, which is a bigger issue, is the press fawning over her. What do you think of that, Dr. Lopkin?
Well, they're trying to kowtow to who they think is going to vote for her. And, basically what we've seen is, she's going to bring the state of California with her, which, quite frankly, Biden was going to get anyway.
No. Electorally, it made no sense. That I agree with. But
yeah, usually when someone picks a running mate, they pick somebody who's going to bring electoral votes that they would not ordinarily get. Somebody from the North picks somebody from the South. Somebody from, more right-leaning areas pick somebody from New York or California. This time they did not do that. And we've got Mr. Romano joining us. He'll be on. Mr. Romano, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Awesome. Mr. Romano, this is great because we were just commenting, and the great doctor was saying that he thought Kamala Harris was not actually that great of a choice. What do you think? I agree with it, by the way, but I have to.
I was going to say, a conservative right-leaning podcast doesn't think Kamala's a great choice. I would completely agree with that. I think I'm looking at it from necessarily like a political landscape perspective, where Biden has been making, I don't know how else to describe, but racist comments about the African-American community, where, obviously if you don't support him, then you ain't black, according to Joe Biden. Most recently, where he said that the African-American community...
Let's just remind our listeners.
Listen, you got to come see us when you come to New York, VP Biden.
I will.
It's a long way until November. We got more questions.
You got more questions, but I tell you, if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, and you ain't black.
Wow.
Right, of course. Yeah, and then he recently made comments about how, and how he basically phrased it was the African-American community lacks diversity in thought. So basically saying that they all think alike. Now,
Mr. Romano, let me just comment on something. I thought that was, and I'm really being as genuine as I possibly can, that was one of the most racist statements you could ever imagine. I couldn't believe it. Like, you're saying basically that these people can't think for themselves. I mean, like, whoa.
But when you take a little bit of a step back and you tie the two statements together, you can understand that Joe Biden actually is telling you, as an African American, you're not allowed to think independently. That you have to be a Democrat and you have to think like Joe Biden and you have to support Joe Biden. How ironic are those two statements,
but
right?
wait a second. I know that's bad. But to
there's no question it's bad.
Say that they actually don't have the capabilities. That's like unbelievable.
Now, hang on a second.
Trump.
Because let's take a step back from this, though. Remember, when Hillary was the candidate, Michelle Obama came out and said, if you're a woman and you don't vote for Hillary, you're not being true to yourself. This is just how the Democrats think. If you're African American, you have to vote for an African American candidate. If you're a woman, you have to vote for a female candidate.
Well,
but
I can understand
that. If you actually say to someone, hold on, if you actually say that, let's say it's Italian Americans or Jewish Americans, let's just say someone actually said, Jewish Americans, they're really not diverse, they think the same. I mean, that is like, thank God he's got the media behind it, because if Donald Trump said that is highly offensive, Mr. Romano.
Well, there's no question, and I think the irony in the two statements of you have to vote for me or you're not black, and then almost being critical of the fact that African Americans think monolithically. But that's why the Kamala Harris pick makes sense for the Biden campaign, because truthfully that he is, and I think a big part of this is because he's an old, rich, white Democrat who supported segregationists. He has kind of a shoddy history when it comes to, remember, he was part of the 90s crime bill, which locked up African-American men. So there's this bad history for African-Americans and Joe Courtney. And so picking Kamala Harris strategically, Joe Biden picking Kamala Harris strategically, I think it's an attempt to shore up the weaknesses.
I don't think he had any choice but to bring on a African-American woman. I'm not sure Ms. Harris was the right one. That's really, the big issue. Now, the other thing is that, to you gentlemen, is that his campaign didn't really get that much of a bump, which I was surprised. Mr. Romano first, then Dr. Lopkin.
Yeah, I don't think that, and again, I don't think picking Kamala was about getting a bump. I think it was about shoring up. Does that make sense? I don't think they expected to see, a massive increase, 5% bump, 3% bump, because it had everything to do with trying to stop the hemorrhaging, for all the gaps in talking about the African American community. And look, there's only one. Joe Biden has made very few public appearances, and what's true. And strategically, he went on that show to talk about African American issues because they know in their internal data that he is not inspiring the community, and it ended up blowing up in his face because of the comments he made. But this is a strategic pick. I think. On the flip side of it, though, bringing the state senator from California, you're in a situation that you're not actually bringing any advantage in the Electoral College for yourself.
No. Dr. Lopkin.
Yeah, this is, as I was saying at the beginning of the show, Kamala Harris was the wrong pick to accomplish their goals. Because what I've seen over the past few days since she was announced are African-American males coming out and saying, well, now there's no way they're going to support the Biden ticket because of her record as Attorney General, when she went after African-American males, when she refused to allow African-American males to get DNA tests that in some cases proved their innocence. She wanted to keep them in jail. So they are coming out against her.
Dr. Lopkin, your point is amazing. And Mr. Romano, I think you'd have to agree with the great doctor. The point is, it may not see the light of day with the mainstream media. When you had Stephanopoulos, which I thought was amazing, calling her a mainstream candidate, that's like me saying, someone saying Mr. Sherman's an NBA candidate.
Well,
I mean, it's crazy.
I had a reporter refer to her as a moderate, and I explained based on what. And the reason that is,
are you kidding?
The reason they call her moderate is because she's waffled on her healthcare plan, like she's gone back and forth, and I think she at the time when she was running for president, she was trying to be all things to everybody, and it got lost in the shuffle. That was not a well-run campaign. She failed to gain any traction with many Democrats, so it'll be interesting.
Wait a second, Mr. Romano. Let's talk about that. It wasn't that. No, her campaign literally flamed out. I'm an observer. I'm not a professional, like you are, but I did observe it very closely. And she had a great moment when she chastised Biden, and she was the darling. And then she just imploded.
But what I find amazing
she did not captivate any kind of audience at all.
But do you know what she said in that moment? I think this is the moment you're referring to. That she believed Joe Biden's victims.
Yeah.
Yes.
Amazing how things. Yeah. Right. Amazing how things turn around in that regard.
Yeah,
and that's going to hurt. That's going to hurt the ticket also, because again, now you've got women going, well, wait a minute. She said she supported Biden's victims, but now she's running with him. It just undermines her credibility even more.
Dr. Lopkin, I think that the whole thing. The more you think about it, did it really ever make sense? If he, I should say, took on, I think that the choice was a conservative, when you talk about the Democrats, that's tough to do, a relative moderate, that's better, African-American woman, maybe a prosecutor, involved in the police, that kind of a person would have been fantastic, but you talk about, both you and Dr. Lopkin those things are going to, how do you walk away from that, Dr. Lopkin? How do you walk away from, first of all, about the busing thing and about the women thing? I mean, how do you do that, Dr. Lopkin?
I honestly don't know how she can walk away from these things. I think these are going to drag her down. And the fact that the mainstream media is describing her as a moderate is actually working against her. Because, as I said at the beginning of the show, I'm starting to hear from progressive left people who are Bernie supporters and AOC supporters, and they're saying there's no way they're going to support a Biden-Harris ticket. They're going to vote for the Green Party, or they're going to throw a vote to Kanye as a write-in, but they will not vote for Biden-Harris.
You bring up two. I know we got to go to a break, but let's talk about the Conway situation. I don't think it's as crazy as people think, is it, Mr. Romano?
Well,
I know he's a little controversial, but he could be a deflecting person.
Well, no. I think the issue for this whole process and understanding this is that in order to get on the ballot, it takes a lot that you have to do.
Mr. Romano, can you repeat that? We lost you there.
What I said was I don't think in order to get on the ballot in some of these states, there's a pretty extensive process. So it'd be very difficult for Kanye to actually get on the ballot in any of these states to actually have an impact. So they may write in his name, but...
Good point. And the media will not pay him any attention because his views is completely diametrically opposed to the mainstream media, which is something we got to take up after the book, I believe.
Yeah, the fact that he's not going to be officially on these ballots means he's not going to be able to participate in debates. The mainstream media is not going to pay him much attention. So he's basically just running a write-in campaign, which, let's face it, it's not going to pull any votes from Trump. It's going to pull from Biden-Harris. And if you guys can just hang on. If you guys can just hang on for a moment, we're going to take a moment and take a break. We'll be right back.
Hi, Chuck. I want to know, what is the census?
The census is a special time when we count every single person in the country.
Do kids and babies count, too?
Of course. Counting everyone in your home helps support your neighborhood by funding schools, hospitals, and more. So complete the census by calling, going online, or returning your form by mail. It's totally private.
Visit 2020census.gov and
make your family count.
Brought to you by Carnegie Corporation of New York and the Ad Council.
And you're listening to Carnivore Radio. You can be part of the conversation by calling us at 563-999-3693. That's 563-999-3693.
Well, we're talking about the electoral process, and I know I'm biased, but Mr. Romano and then Dr. Lopkin, your view. Supposedly, Biden's up by, I would say, anywhere from 6 to 8 points. I don't see that as solid, Mr. Romano.
Well, anything can happen. I mean, correct. I think there's certainly, at this point, I can't remember, but Trump's numbers have been very similar to Obama's going back, and I think when he ran the second time. I think a lot of this has to do with who's going to come out and vote. I think if you are definitely afraid of what's happening in places like Portland and Minnesota and think the Democrats handling rioters and protesters with kids' gloves, I shouldn't say protesters, rioters with kids' gloves, and allowing them space to destroy, that's the Democrat mantra. That's what you're going to see in Joe Biden, is this placating of these violent leftists who they know they need in order to win elections, right? Because they're the ones that are hounding out Republicans. They're the ones that are hounding out anyone that dare question their policies. And so this would become the norm if Democrats are elected, because they appease and approve of these tactics.
Now, Mr. Romano, though, do you think, and I'm sorry to say it's unfortunate that I'm much older than you, but I do remember as a kid, and I was only a kid, but I do remember 1968. Does history repeat itself? I mean, I believe that Humphrey would have won if it wasn't for the uprising of 1968. I would bet the ranch on that he would have won.
I can't speak to that. I mean, I love American history. I don't know exactly that, but what I can tell you is the protests in the 60s were nowhere near these. These are and it's not just violence. It's violence against their neighbors. It's violence against people who are just trying to go to work. It's violence against, stopping a fire truck from getting and an ambulance from getting to a family that needs them. It's very different from the 60s. I wouldn't even put them in the same category. This is something else. In the 60s, I think, is that everyone came together after the fact and it calmed down. In this particular case, these rioters and anarchists and agitators are literally talking about overthrowing the system, and at any means necessary. That's violence, destruction, and it is. If you want that to continue, vote for Democrat, because that's exactly what's going to happen.
Dr. Lopkin.
Yeah, I think there are some very important differences. protests in the 60s, there were a lot more peaceful protests. You did have riots. You did have riots, but they were targeted to specific neighborhoods. You did have some of what's going on now that was, inexcusable. But now you have more than just rioters. You have looters. And these are folks that have no real political agenda. They're just taking advantage of the situation to rob, steal, destroy property. And I think that difference is important.
Yeah, I think there's another big difference. Yes, I think there's another big difference. Go ahead. But another big difference, Eric, is that in the 60s you had a legitimate cause, like it or not, which was Vietnam. Now you have, it's basically, I don't want to be an alarmist, but you're talking about basically people that believe in a revolution, Dr. Lopkin. Am I not correct? They might not happen, but you read their charter, it's a revolution.
To a certain point, you do have a legitimate issue. There is racism still going on. We do still need to treat people more equally. The problem is, in the 60s, the people with the legitimate cause still had mostly control over what was going on. Now, the folks with the legitimate cause are being drowned out by looters.
Well, that's my whole point. When I said there's not a legitimate grievance, I'll throw out to Mr. Romano, is yes, it initially started totally legitimate. Now it's morphed into something completely different, and I think other factors and influencers have taken over. Mr. Romano, your comment.
Well, there's no question that some of the protests have been used for the purposes that they were not intended, the looters and the rioters. So I would agree with that some of this is opportunism. But the problem is that you still have, when Democrat elected officials that want to pretend like this isn't a problem, that, people aren't being injured, businesses aren't being injured, and lives aren't being destroyed by these and people's things. And when you talk about it, the Democrats will be justified in this. And I know in the case of some of the, there's people calling, don't do this. But, that is not a protest. Portland is consistent. Right? And the other thing is important.
Well, we're losing you again.
No, but I think Dr. Lopkin, I think what he really, was saying, I did hear some of it, is that it's morphed into something different. Dr. Lopkin?
It's definitely morphed into something different. But now, you've got a situation where even Democratic politicians need to be held responsible. I actually just read an article in the Hartford Business Journal talking about the fact that Connecticut, which is one of the most progressive states out there, is actually one of the most segregated states. We have our education system has already been found guilty in the courts of violating civil rights, and yet our Democratic leadership has done nothing to change education funding. Our housing department has been found guilty of violating civil rights. Our politicians have done nothing to change this. So,
but wait a second.
It's really naive to think that the Democrats are going to do something.
But wait a second. Isn't that liberalism, Mr. Romano? Hopefully you won't be broken up on this. Is that like Bernie Sanders? Do as I say, not as I do. He's got 3 and he's never done better. Connecticut is a perfect example. Granted, you know the deal. Tell me about
it. the fallacy of the mission of the Democrat Party is that it's about the people. It's not. It's about power. And so what happens is you can only go so far and try to solve problems where all your solutions are discovered to not work. And so now they have to blame other things because they don't want to admit incompetence. And so in Connecticut, for example, they talk about the segregation issue, and they're blaming zoning laws. Now, I understand redlining exists. It doesn't exist anymore. But this whole idea, and what's funny about the idea of how they're challenging these zoning laws, that you shouldn't be allowed to own a one-lot acre to build on, right? That you should be able to put more housing there or whatever it may be, or you should be allowed, is that somehow people of color are all poor and that they can't afford 1 acre, or they'll never be in an opportunity to have 1 acre. And I think that's the irony to this idea of pushing, particularly in Connecticut, that they want a statewide mandate on zoning laws, and it's all centered around that the Democrats have created systems that fail, and they can't adjust and look at the systems and say we have to do it differently, so they just find a new thing to screw up.
Yeah, it really is amazing how progressive the state of Connecticut is supposed to be, and yet how backwards we are in race relations.
Yeah. It's
but it's the whole thing about do as I say, not as I do. Because yes, you're living in Stamford, you're living in, Greenwich. It doesn't affect you. It's all lip service, isn't it, in the end?
Well, yeah, and again, it just goes back to power, right? When you talk about the Democrats have controlled these cities for many, many years, and things don't get better, and they'll blame everybody else. They'll blame the suburbs. They'll blame everyone in the state, but they won't own the policies that they voted in place that has created the environment that has led to failure.
Real quick, because I know we're kind of a little bit up against it, but I did see some information last night that was amazing. There is some of these big liberal cities, I'm talking major cities, New York, there is people leaving in droves as we come up to our hard cutoff. What do you think of that? First, Mr. Romano, and then Dr. Lopkin. I mean, it's happening.
There's no question that it's happening. I mean, I think that New York has become a place that's unsafe. Crime's risen at 280% or somewhere in that area, and particularly New York City. And the mayor, this Democrat liberal mayor, is pretending as though it's not a problem, and that somehow the residents that decided to leave are quitters. Right? He made some speech about how they'll be replaced in this arrogant fashion, and at the end of the day, that goes to show the care that Mayor de Blasio and Democrats have for the people in their community. They really don't care about you. They don't care about your concerns. They want to pretend like things are fine, even though the numbers are the numbers. I would venture that many people who fled the city, I just hope they don't take their voting habits with them.
Yeah, I don't think any of it was really a surprise. We saw this in the 70s with white flight from New York. The thing is, when things get that bad, the people that have the ability to leave do. And that's what we're seeing now. And we are actually right up against it. So, Mr. Romano, thank you so much for coming on again. We love having you. You've
Thank
been
you very much.
listening
Appreciate
to
it.
Carnivore Radio. We broadcast live at 4 o'clock every Friday at blogtalkradio.com/Carnivore Radio. And you can catch the replay as well as the Carnivore Bites podcast at xvadio.com/podcast, the Apple Podcast Store, Google Play, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Stitcher, and wherever you find podcasts. So we look forward to hearing from you, and we'll see you again next week.